Yeah, that's a good point, is that as we study, we often face these challenges of brain fog, and certainly that can happen in different ways at different times of the day. So some people take a while to wake up, etc. And then, as you say, focusing too long on one point, it's useful to write up the question, to place the question on the wall, to print it out, to engage with the question, to think about it freshly each day, and on different days we can see it in different ways. So a big welcome to everyone today. So thank you each one for being a part of today's class. We're going to look at weeks 3 and 4, and we're looking at Jesus' approach and Christian approach to teaching. Then we're moving on to historical approaches, which include Augustine. And then we have this amazing quote on do we follow the majority of people in safe ways too often, or are we like the 3% who think radically different in fresh new ways? And how do we encourage that in our students to think radically differently in fresh new ways? But let's begin in prayer. And then we're asking students to write down 1, 2, or 3 questions they have, and also what's working for them, what they're learning. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to learn from one another. We thank you for the opportunity to study and learn. And we thank you that you are a source of all knowledge to us, and that you've given us opportunity to share that knowledge with one another and with the students that we teach. Amen. So Janelle, what questions might you have, and what's working well for you?
I don't really have any questions as such at the moment. I've sort of been playing catch up, and I finally feel like I'm on top of it slightly, which is okay at the moment. I think one of my challenges at the moment is with the 4 subjects. Like, we've started to see over the last week or so how all the knowledge and our readings and things are all combined across the 4 subjects that we're doing, with our worldviews and our critical thinking and our academic writing. Like, it's all coming together, which is kind of confusing and creating a bit of that brain fog you're just talking about, remembering which content is belonging to each subject. So that's probably one of my challenges at the moment. I'm lucky to be in a hub, so a lot of my questions, I can rely on our girls in the Wilcannia Forbes hub. They've been fantastic at helping if we get stuck on something. So probably why I don't have many questions at the moment. It's been really beneficial for me. So.
And I think that is one of the challenges, is looking at 4 subjects and how you distinguish between the 4 subjects, because they so very much bleed into one another. Certainly one way is the folders on your computer. And so you can keep in folders on your computer an outline of each subject, what are the major things that are being aimed at there. You can also keep some headings. What are we looking at? And so here it's helpful to keep going back to the concept of thinking, critical thinking, and then look at some of the big ideas we have there in terms of thinking. And then just a quick summary of the 10 weeks, and also 2 major approaches that we take to thinking, one being the scientific, critical, analytical approach to thinking, and then the other being the broader, more subjective humanities approach that realizes that there's much more. And this is reflected in Aristotle and Plato. So Aristotle says thinking focuses on this scientific, careful, measured way of observing, describing, and yet at the same time we recognize that thinking often includes the intuitive and the spiritual, and awareness of humility and mystery. And so I think having those summaries before you can be helpful. Olivia, what questions do you have? What's working?
A bit like Nell with the question. I don't really have one at the moment because the teaching hubs really helped me too. But my I guess, my struggle, academic writing of things.
Yeah, and certainly I think academic writing is a whole subject itself, and you have studies on that, and often you can have extra resources on the academic writing. And if you've not done academic writing for a while, it takes a little while to pick up on what it's about. Certainly academic writing is very much about reading, and so you've got to find the resources quickly, easily, and that can be a challenge. But getting familiar with the library and the online library resources, once you've mastered that, then that's very, very helpful. And then associated with that is the whole idea of referencing. And so it's important to know what's the method of referencing author, year and page within the assignment in brackets. And it seems the more often you can put in references to an author, year and page, the better you do. Putting commas and full stops in the right place is important. And then at the end, you need the full bibliographical referencing details. So certainly that's one of the academic writing areas. And then another is paragraphs and how your paragraphs are constructed. And so a paragraph, you can't just have 2 or 3 sentences like you do if you're a journalist. You want longer paragraphs to more fully develop your ideas. You want interaction with 1 or 2 scholars in the paragraphs. And then your overall essay structure needs an introduction, and it needs a conclusion, and then it needs its ideas being developed. So I think those sort of things are important. Olivia, how have you gone developing this academic writing skill? What's worked for you? What's helped?
Well, doing the course with the academic writing, but yeah, it's still like I haven't been in school for a while, so it's just trying to process all even the academic language and things like that. So yeah.
And certainly academic language is one of the big challenges. Every subject you do will have its own academic language, and so it'll be important to develop a way of finding the meaning of words. Of course, one of the great things that you can do is you can Google, and even in lectures, if it's a live lecture that you're sitting in, I'll sometimes and often Google what's the meaning of a term, what's the meaning of a word. So I think that can be very important. Just the last couple of days, someone raised the topic of cognitive psychology. And so I just Googled cognitive psychology. Wikipedia always brings up some great answers, but you must never quote Wikipedia. And there'll be popular sources as well, but you don't quote the popular sources as well there. So be aware of these. Now, someone's saying they've got a black screen. Hands up those who've got a black screen. So it would appear that everyone, hands up those who can see some notes with the word essay structure. Yeah, so it sounds like it's mostly good there. So thank you there. And then thank you down in the waiting room. We'll let Amy in. So very good. Tiffany, any questions? What's working well? How's things going?
I don't have any questions. I feel like no one he has any questions, but I'm sure we will as we go along. Something that's been working well for me, I liked reading about truth and gaining knowledge about our own truth, what we believe truth is, how we see it, why we see it that way. That was really interesting to me. Also, I loved the way that I could see Jesus teaching in a way that I hopefully will teach, and how teachers still teach today. They instruct, but also facilitate, and it's important that we act on our instructions. And if we're telling a student to do something, we should be able to do it ourselves.
Yes, that's so important, isn't it? I think that's really good and well said. Leonie, all the way over, it's 6:15 a.m. in South Africa, I think. So Leonie, any questions and what's working well?
I don't have any questions at the moment. But yeah, it's been a rough week for me. I had a assessment that's due this weekend for another subject, so I was concentrating really hard on that. So yeah, so this week just really made me realize how important goal setting and structure is in your personal life. So yeah.
And I think that's part of the challenge. So Olivia mentioned the challenge of essay writing, and then also I think time management is one of the big challenges. And as you say, when you've got an assignment due, then you really have to focus on that assignment, and you have to find ways of keeping your studies in other areas going. So I think if you've got an assignment due, then certainly 50% or more of your time really focuses on that assignment that is due. And then you've got to find other time that you can do a little bit of work. Certainly one of the things, again, using folders on your computer is to take some brief notes, to cut and paste, gather material, and then you plan to go back with it. One of the amazing things about tertiary study is that they keep you moving on week by week onto new topics. And if you were doing this without the discipline of moving on week by week, you'd go on for months looking at one aspect and area, like Jesus and teaching. You go on for weeks and weeks doing that, but we only give half of 1 week to that topic, and then you're told you've got to move on. And that's part of training you to cover a lot of material quickly and effectively. Some of the ways that you can help organise your time: one is to put up a calendar, which might have the 6-month semester on it. And so you might print that, hang that up on the wall, colour in due days, scribble all over it. And the other is you can have a weekly timetable when you write down how many hours you're putting into each area, and you look for extra time space. I found it helpful to write down, say, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then under that, I would see that, say, from 5 to 7 or 8 a.m. So that's 3 or 4 hours I've got even before I go to work that I could put in some study time. And then later in the evening, I might put in some time as well. And then Saturday mornings, I might put in some time. So there are ways in which you can there as well that will be important. So think about different ways you manage your time that will be helpful. Mauricia, what is working for you? What questions might you have?
I don't really have any questions yet either, like anybody else. And I've kind of been concentrating on a different subject essay. So everything feels a little bit like it's meshed up in my brain at the moment. So I don't have any wonderful insights for you. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to keep it together.
No, that's good. And that sort of shares with everyone the reality that you've got to focus on the assignments that are due, and you've got to be aware of those differences as well. So let's go on now and have a look at the forum of teaching methods of Jesus. And there's some great insights there as we look at the different articles. Amy, how did you go with the teaching methods of Jesus? What did you like about John McCoy's article? What did you gain from this? Amy?
Hi. I'm just trying to remember it because I think it was posted on Sunday, right? I think I actually posted it late. I'm really sorry. I thought it was really interesting. I thought he made some really good points. I probably sound really critical when I wrote everything, because it felt very personal rather than like an academic, I guess, writing. And I did agree with the methods that he raised. I thought it was important, but I was quite critical when I wrote mine.
And this raises an important good point, is what's it mean to be critical? And I think generally we would say in this subject, to have a critical approach is often very, very beneficial. One of the challenges with the critical approach is that how do you ground it in the end? If you go to church on Sunday and take your academic critical approach to the church service, or if you stand up to preach, then that won't necessarily go down well. Everyone wants a positive message that picks them up like a good cup of coffee with lots of sugar, but you can't live on coffee and sugar, though some people would tell me otherwise. And so I think the critical approach is very, very good and very valuable. But at the same time, you have to be able to pick your audience. What I like about this, Amy, is you've got references, you're showing different viewpoints, and that's one of the ways that you can strengthen a critical approach, is that you can say scholar so-and-so has one view, another scholar has another view. So it's not just you subjectively being critical, it's objectively looking at different perspectives and different viewpoints. So that's very valuable. Karen, how did you go with Jesus and his approach to teaching? What are your thoughts, Karen, on Jesus and his approach to teaching?
Very insightful reading this week, and I really enjoyed doing this forum post because it actually gave me a lot of insight into how the parallels between us as teachers and Jesus as a teacher. So I found it quite easy to write about. I really enjoyed it. So I'm sure that other people have their different views, and I haven't read through everyone's post, so I must do that. But no, it was really good, and I could see how teaching within class. I did my first teaching session on Thursday, which was, in my opinion, was a bit of a failure, but the teacher said it was okay. It was about listening, and it was about seeing the students' reactions, how they were taking in their activity as such. But all in all, I just found like the parallels are quite strong.
Yeah, that's excellent. And this raises for me the challenge of thinking about how we teach as Christian teachers. So what does it mean to be a Christian teacher, and how we learn from Jesus? I guess there's two practices that Jesus had that really stand out to me. One is prayer, and you'll notice that we began today with prayer. And so my wife and I and family and I will often begin each day with prayer, and in a Christian school and environment I'll often begin with prayer. So I think prayer reminds us about an openness to the presence of God, and an awareness of what God is doing. And often in the middle of prayer, our whole thinking is reoriented from focusing on panic mode or focusing on self to focusing on the greatness of God and the bigness of God. When I wake up first thing of the morning, for some people it's before they've had coffee, but for me it's before I've had prayer and Bible reading. The world is a dangerous place, I'm concerned. And then for some people, their coffee changes that. For me, prayer and Bible reading changes that. And the same thing can happen in the classroom. Having a moment of prayer, having a moment of Bible reading can make a big difference. And I see that in Jesus' teaching, that his dependence on the Bible and his awareness of Bible passages and quoting Bible passages is very, very useful and helpful. So that's a good practice, is to have a Bible reading as well. It was interesting, I was speaking to a teacher yesterday from a Quaker church school, and some of you may know that in Quaker church or school they have a few moments of silence where they sit in silence and reflect and contemplate. And I thought that's a good practice in the classroom, is to begin each day with a moment of silence and reflection. I got a chance to go to a Quaker service at one stage, and they will sometimes sit for an hour and a half in silence, just being open. And so I thought that's an interesting approach. Not everyone's way to go, but it reminds us of your spiritual practices, such as prayer, Bible reading in the life of Jesus made a difference. One of the interesting aspects of reading through the Gospels, and I encourage you, if you've got time, read through chapter 1 to the last chapter of the Gospels and reflect on Jesus' approach to teaching. One of the real challenges is that Jesus has real success in his ministry in the first of 3 years of ministry, and then the second of 3 years, things get tougher and there is opposition. And do you have thoughts sometimes that if you're a school teacher, you'll often have some opposition from parents, from a third of your class students who don't follow the way you're doing things, and maybe some of the admin who are all about getting numbers down rather than creative approaches to teaching. And so you've got to learn to work with these different approaches. Libby, do you have thoughts on what's the best Jesus-like Christian way to approach opposition when you face difficulties?
I think not to jump to conclusions and judge and assume something. I think we just need to listen. I think Jesus would listen and learn about their background and history and where they're coming from. And then with good communication and building up a relationship, then we can just sort of go, okay, we're here to support you. What can we do? And ask the question to them, how can we support you? And then try and come up with a plan together. But I suppose, yeah, to try and show love. Jesus shows love to the people, even the people that are against him. He'd always show love.
Yeah, that's really well said. That a Jesus approach is one that listens. The person caught in adultery, or Nicodemus, who's the great theologian, Jesus listens, he interacts, he shares. And whether it be students, teachers, parents, or admin, we can face challenges. I mentioned before cognitive psychology, and in cognitive psychology, it's how you think, frame, consider what language you use to describe what's going on shapes the way you think about things. And so if a student says, I don't like what you're saying, or if a parent says, I don't like what you're saying, cognitive psychology reminds us that our brain might kick into emergency panic mode and say, that student really dislikes me. I better take a tough stand here, or fight or flight. And the same with if a parent says that. But you've said very well, Libby, that the Jesus approach is to pause, to recognize God is in control. He's working all things out for good, and to love and to show love. A great example of that in the Old Testament is Joseph, who's rejected by his brothers, thrown into a pit. And so the last part of Genesis really reminds us, you meant things for evil at the end of the Joseph narrative, but God meant all things for good. And so Jesus reminds us of this view that God is working all things out for good. So I think that's a great reminder. Well said, Libby. Bring the love of God, bring the peace of God, bring the hope of God, bring the joy of God. When we read Paul's writings, we read there in Galatians and Romans how people can bring in a certain legalism, but that's not going to be the answer. What you need is love and joy and hope and the fruits of the Spirit. And so I think that's really what a Christian approach to teaching is about. Now, has anyone read the end of the Gospels as to what happens when Jesus shows a Christian approach to life and the world? They take him before Herod, they take him before Pilate, they take him before the religious leaders of the time, and they put him on trial. And then they crucify him. Anyone here have any experience being crucified because of your teaching? I was challenged a bit with that reading that said, be like the 3% who try to do things differently. Probably all 3% get crucified. And so you've got to be aware that in teaching, you might have 3 good years, but there could be the 1 year in which the parents and the students give you the challenge. And so you've got to know what are the ways to respond. And I think the Gospels remind us that God is in control, he's with us, and that he is working things out for good in the tough years. Bridget, any thoughts that you have when you face the tough time, when everything goes against you? You got the parents against you, the students against you, the admin against you, the other teachers against you. What do you do in that 1 year in 3 or 4 where things don't go so well, Bridget?
Probably hide under the table and don't come out.
The tortoise approach.
I think probably the best approach is to actually talk about it. Talk to someone, get some support, get just not necessarily people in your corner, but just talk it out and process it. I think would be a great thing. And meeting, like having a meeting with them and, you know, coming to a conclusion of moving forward.
Yeah, and even that may not always go well, but I think you've got to be true to yourself, and you've got to know what your values are, and you've got to say openly and carefully, without attacking, saying, this is the way I experience things, this is the way I saw things, and this is my perspective on these things, and you have the freedom to make your decisions, and you can get put into a class that you don't like or moved where you don't like. Things can really go against you. And in some churches, they have images of Jesus suffering, and they have the 12 or 13 stations of the cross. And every year you go around and you look at those. And I think we're reminded that in life there can be times of suffering. And about a third of the Gospels is about that. And Peter and Paul remind us of that. So Marissa said that we gain our strength from Scripture and knowing that God is with us in these difficult times. The Psalms can be really helpful. Count it all joy. Know that these trials are for us as gifts from God to help us to grow. Marissa, did you want to say any more on that? That's enough there.
I'm good, thanks.
Yep, excellent. Rachel, do you have some thoughts on when things go tough? When how does Jesus' message help us? How does the gospel help us when we've got our students, the teachers, the parents, the admin, all against us, and we feel like Jesus being whipped and all of that? What's the Christian response to this situation that comes up now and again?
So I think personally, and like I've had quite a lot go on the past couple of weeks personally, and similar situations starting to happen at school, that like we should all be like, as Christian and Christian teachers, we need to be grounded in Christ and grounded in Scripture. So like, and I know personally, I find it very hard that when I'm going through those kind of things to reach out to the Bible and to reach out to God in a sense, because sometimes you're just like, no, I can do it myself. But remembering that I think like the best one that I've ever had was in youth, when we were talking about like the driver's seat, is letting God take control of that driver's seat and just grounding ourselves back in prayer. Because like, and I know myself, I'm a very combative person. I can be very like, I can kind of have a go at people sometimes if I don't filter myself, that like maybe it's not necessarily directly coming from them for a bad reason, but it's like, in that sense, letting God take control back of that situation and trusting in him that he's got our best interest at heart.
Yeah, so important. And you've mentioned there going to God, Bible and prayer, and others have mentioned going to other people we trust. And so you've got to find people around you that can provide support. And there's also other support mechanisms more widely. And so there can be counselling available. And sometimes I would encourage people to go to counselling. Even the government provide Medicare counselling where you can go to a doctor and get a referral, and you can have counselling. And it's better to have counselling early than to be too proud and think I can handle it all on myself and get into a more and more difficult situation. And I think even tablets, you can have doctors can prescribe tablets that, 1 year in 10 or whatever, there would certainly be teachers on staff who've got stressed for various reasons, doctors have had to give them the tablets. And as Christians, we can think we don't need tablets or chemicals or whatever, but that can be dangerous to ignore doctors. It's a bit like if you break your leg, you need a splint. If you face a really challenging situation, there's Lifeline in Australia and other counselling services, and you can ring up, and at the other end, I don't know whether they're really helpful, but they can certainly give you positive messages, things will work out and all of that. And you need that. You need someone to talk to. And there'll be people in school and other areas. One of the challenges in school, you'll find sometimes if you talk to one teacher or an admin, then that'll go to another teacher and admin. So you've got to find people as well that are safe spaces. And we've got to realise this is exactly the same for students. If they're getting bullied or things are going tough, then they need safe spaces and they need people to talk to. And we as teachers need to be Christ to the students in the classroom, and that there can be other teachers who are facing challenges, and we need to provide support for the other teachers as well. And there can be admin who are facing challenges, and even the head of the school could be facing challenges. So we realise to face difficulties, we're not alone. I'm reminded you can face medical difficulties. I've met people even this last year who you can get an illness, and because you're not up to the top of your game, parents, students, admin, everyone can turn against you. You can break a leg or arm and everyone can turn against you because you're not up to your game. So Jesus, I think, suffering on the cross, the whole of the gospel message, Joseph in the Old Testament, there's a lot to remind us about the Christian way of responding to the challenges. So is that a little bit helpful? Just reflecting for a few moments there on that aspect of the gospel. We could then also reflect on the victorious aspect of the gospel. Libby.
Yeah, I just had a thought. When a way a Christian probably shouldn't respond, and that's when if we're facing opposition, and sometimes we have a tendency, even as Christians, to go around and tell other people of what's going on, and sort of coming up as gossip and stirring up trouble in amongst each other, and that can make a bigger issue. So instead, maybe we should just take a step back and use the appropriate channels.
Oh, exactly. Very well said. So it's also been said personally, prayer, Bible. So this is Amy Lou, stillness necessary in those moments. And when it's more serious, talking it out with trusted people who aren't going to gossip, aren't going to go and share it with others. Taking time. Realise there's no shame in reaching out for counselling. That is, we all face physical problems, mental challenges, challenges at home. There's all sorts of deeper issues that we all face. We gain our strength from Scripture, knowing that God is with us, count it all joy. Scripture says, as Mauricia says here, the Department of Education offers free counselling service for their teachers, so it's important to be aware and to recognise parents can be facing challenges. What can we offer? Students can be facing challenges. What's the different resources that are available when people face those challenges there? So I think that's very, very important to be aware of the resources that we have available to us. Matilda, your thoughts on Christian approaches to teaching, and then Connor and Ethan. Matilda, and you can post up on the chat if you have difficulty getting through in other ways, Matilda, Connor and Ethan. Matilda, your thoughts on Christian approaches to teaching in the good times and the tough times?
Oh, can everybody hear me, by the way?
Yes, very good.
Okay, great. Sorry, I've been trying to turn on my camera and it turns on for like 2 seconds and then shuts off, and now it won't even turn on. So I'm not sure what's going on, but I can definitely speak, so that's all good. Christian approaches to teaching in the good and the bad times. I think definitely prayer is, the biggest part. It's turning to God. We've got the gift of the Holy Spirit, so leaning into that for wisdom when we're approaching lessons, approaching our students. If we have to talk to parents about things that are going on with their kids, if we're having difficulties in classrooms. And I think seeing also just going back to how Jesus taught as well. When I was reading through the article for our forum posts for last week, it was really it was very it resonated with me a lot, because I sometimes forget that Jesus was a teacher. That was a huge part. We saw him do miracles, and we saw him impact people's lives and show them love, but he was also here to teach. He was here to give us lessons that we could use walking forward in our lives and relate to our own situations. So looking at Jesus as a teacher, he teaches us, the things that we can use when we're put in difficult situations. And I think the verse that came to mind was, be slow to speak and quick to listen. So when you are facing, problems as a teacher, quick to listen to why your students are struggling, what they're finding hard, why, they're not cooperating in class. Same as if your parents come to you and they're saying, I'm not happy with this, or this is going on. And so we're being quick to listen to that, but then, coming back to that place of, God knows what I need. He knows, what needs to happen here, and he has the ultimate wisdom. So yeah, I think as far as being a Christian teacher, we have that access to the Holy Spirit, which means that we can utilize that as we go forward and we face problems, or as we're setting up a lesson plan or anything like that.
Yeah, that's so well said. And Jesus was such an example when he faced difficulties and he was taken to the cross. He had confidence in God. He looked to God, and he believed that all things would work together for good. So that was very good. Connor, your thoughts on Christian approaches to teaching in the good times and tough times?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, good.
Perfect. Yeah, so one thing I really enjoyed about this last reading now about Jesus' teachings and that was that while Jesus taught, he used to sit down in that. And generally, when I think of teachers, you walk into the classes and that, and they all stand up controlling the classroom and that. And I actually had I was substituting for the grade 2s this week, and I actually used it in a practical manner. And for some of the lessons and that, I actually sat on the floor with them, or instead of standing in front of them, and they actually listened more to me than when I was standing, which is quite interesting. But I'm not sure how it would work with the older grades or anything, but with the younger students, when I sat on the floor, they actually connected more with me. And I feel it's because I came down to their level in a bit, so I'm not too, how you say, frightening or threatening to them.
I like what you say there, Connor, in terms of stepping into their world. You can be an art teacher who's telling them about art, or you can be an art teacher who's also doing a painting with them. You can be a sports teacher telling them about soccer or athletics, or you can be a sports teacher who's playing the game with them, participating with them. You can be a poetry teacher talking about poetry to the students, or you can be a poetry teacher writing poetry, bearing your life and the wrestle. And the same we've found today in talking about essay writing. Just this last day, I was reading about one of the great authors, writers who wrote in France and great books, and they said they struggled to write. And I thought, when you meet teachers who struggle, and I find people who've got PhDs and doctorates who struggle to write, I find it encouraging when you meet teachers who are struggling. I find it encouraging when you meet preachers who admit they're struggling. You can get some preachers stand up on the pulpit on a Saturday or Sunday morning and say, life is wonderful, everything's a blessing. And then you get other preachers who stand up and say, there can be struggles in our life. I get really blessed by people who admit that there are struggles in their life. And I think that's true of teachers. And you have to find the balance, of course. You have to know when there are times to stand up, as you said, Connor, and say, these are the things we stand for. And then when are the times to sit down with the students? Generally, the importance is to stand up early, and to give clarity, what's expected. And then as we move further into the class, to reveal more of the human moments and say, reveal that we're human and real as well. Any other thoughts on those Christian approaches? Ethan, what are your thoughts on Christian approaches?
Morning. So actually I was let into all my classes like super late for some reason. They messed up my enrollment. So I'm still trying to catch up on everything for like the past 2.5, 3 weeks, because they messed up my enrollment a bit. So I haven't got this far just yet. I'm getting there. This has been pretty intense trying to catch up on all my classes. But what I've taken so far from everyone else is that, so the biggest thing I've learned so far is the sitting down thing was really good. The teaching, just being led by the Holy Spirit, I think with your classes would be another cool thing. I think it's cool. I don't really know what to say now, because I've been so like far behind, but so I'm still trying to catch up.
Yeah. And that's great, isn't it, to hear one another's vulnerabilities. And quite a few students have said today they're wrestling with 4 subjects, wrestling with assignments, wrestling with catching up. And I think this shows the value of moving together with one another and working together, having people around you. So let's move on to another aspect of the class, which is discussion thread 4. And discussion thread 4, we look at the majority is always wrong. And I find this a very challenging thread, but I think our thoughts are flowing over into this one here. So Rolkin's view, the majority is always wrong, I found very, very challenging, because we are taught in the school that the majority group is going to be right. And so in a school, as someone said, we have these systems in place in which there is normalization. This is what is expected. And so Karen's said very well, these are the things that are expected. Karen, do you have some thoughts here on normalize? Because you've got to have industry standards. You've got to have policies. You've got to have procedures. You've got to have normalisation. How do we balance all of these things with the freedom to be yourself, to express yourself, to be alive? And I found that quite a challenging balance. And yet there's an answer, an important answer that we're wrestling with here. Karen, do you have a few thoughts on this?
Well, I actually really enjoyed reading this and watching the video clip. I actually spoke to my husband and the builder that we hear the other day about this, and we were discussing about how the majority is wrong, and they couldn't get their head around it, which was quite interesting. But when I put it into perspective with, for example, like with my post, how we do have policies, procedures, we have deadlines, we have all these things that we must meet. But then how can we step outside that and bring further thinking within ourselves, within our students, within our relationship with God? And I did struggle. I thought, well, how can we do that? And it's all about being open. So yes, we can teach the curriculum as we are dictated to teach it, but the underlying message of like our beliefs can come through in our teachings. And that all comes down to, once again, morals, you know, being honest with the students, being honest with ourselves. That's how I interpret it anyway.
Yeah, very, very good example there. And I know with building, we've had builders come around, and sometimes if they just followed the letter of the building law, they wouldn't do what you need to be done. Sometimes they've got to be a bit creative and aware of new materials, different ways of doing things. As you say, you need to be open and transparent. I saw an example of a building built by someone the other day, and it was all made of glass, and they were wanting to put across the emphasis that transparency and openness is so important. And we really do face it with the curriculum. That is, you've got to cover the curriculum material, but at the same time, the curriculum can be life-destroying if you just rigidly stick to it. And so you've got to find that balance. How do you cover 100% of the curriculum but leave time for freedom and areas of interest that students raise? And certainly in terms of Christian beliefs, if you're in a secular school, how do you bring in your Christian beliefs, and how do you follow the commitment to secularization? If you're in a religious school, how do students, not every student is going to, 25, 30 students is going to have identical beliefs to the beliefs of the head of the school, etc. So you need this freedom for flexibility, and the same with morals. Certainly you need to say, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not cheat, the 10 Commandments, Book of Deuteronomy. But at the same time, what happens when students fall into a lie? You need that openness and transparency. And so like Jesus, you need to, with the adulteress and with the tax collector, Jesus was a friend of sinners. He was a friend of the failed. And the gospel is open to all people, and it invites all people in. So I think there's a gospel message in discussion thread 4 about that balancing of standards, policies, but also being open there as well. So we certainly recognise the benefits and importance of norms, the benefits and importance of professionalism, the benefits and importance of academic results. And we've talked about this in IQ tests, but we need to recognise that life is more than these. We need the textbook, we need contracts of performance. Olivia, what were your thoughts on the box and things being in the box? Olivia?
I actually thought, I really liked this one as well. It really made me think about how I think. And actually seeing the visual, like, you know, there's the legal boundaries, there's the physical boundary, like the 4 boundaries that we think within is quite interesting. But then when you put it on the actual page, that it was a smaller box that we actually think in with those boundaries.
Yeah, and you mentioned them, the legal, the technical, the physical, the moral, all of these are there. Can you tell us, tell us a bit more about these boundaries and how we balance these?
Oh, well, as in teaching or just
in life in general too, yeah.
Yeah, well, legally, like, I really liked his expression, like, you know, like you've got old mate sitting beside you. Are you going to steal his wallet to fund your uni work? Like, you know, there's all legal things we have to follow. Like, there's protocols that we have to follow here at school. What else can I say? I've got nothing else to say.
yeah. But at the time, sometimes you could face the legal things and you could miss out on what showing love and truth is all about, couldn't you? And this is what the Apostle Paul writes about in Galatians and Romans. Some people follow the law, and the example I have there is a running track. That is, you don't become a good runner by focusing on the boundaries of the running track. The good running comes from within. Good running comes from exercise, good diet. All of these things come from within. And I think that's the same with life and the same with good morals, that it comes from within. Just saying don't steal doesn't make a person perfect. And the same in all that we do. In a few weeks' time, we'll look at morals. And one of the questions we'll ask is, if you find $1, what do you do? If you find $10, what do you do? If you find $10,000 sitting in a packet on the side of the road? And so morals partly relates to the size of the issues that are involved. And so I think this is a great article. I think hands up all those who really like this article by Rolkins. I think everyone would see huge value and interest in that. It challenges us that life is more than this legalism. So Clara Rolkins discusses how typically we think in predetermined norms, but true thinking by many students goes beyond Plato's cave to think creatively. And then we also have here the thought Clara raises on when students ask the big questions, why is there something more than nothing? Clara, do you have some more thoughts on students who ask the silly questions, the big questions, the unanswerable questions? Why is it important to give freedom for these big questions? So is Clara with us? Clara may not be with us today. No. So I've just gone through. But I think such an important point that's raised here from Lloyd is that real thinking is the freedom to ask the unanswerable questions. And I think we need to have that, don't we? So it's a great insight that lets children have the freedom to ask the unanswerable questions. And this leaves us in awe of God and how enormous and unfathomable and how wide and broad his thoughts are. Marissa, you said that Lloyd, when he says the mark of a good teacher is the number of questions that they raise. Marissa, do you have a few thoughts on that?
Yeah, I too really enjoyed, and I actually do remember these because I just did them last night. So I haven't lost them in my brain somewhere. I really, really enjoyed that video by Lloyd in particular. And I kind of just naturally fall into this habit. Like, I do it with my own kids too. Maybe as a kid, I probably was an annoying why kid. Why? Tell me more. I want to learn more about this, or something like that. So if we can, as teachers, I just feel like if we can get this, well, like I said, that like what a gift it is to give to our students to help them be passionate about being curious, because then it won't just be about what we teach them now. Hopefully they'll go on to be 25, 30-year-olds who still have this thirst to want to know more about whatever it is that, you know, they feel passionate about.
Yeah, so good. So I think it was a really great article, and then it also connects with Augustine. He asks the big questions of his time. I thought this actually connects with where do we go to for answers? What are some of the things that are good teaching methods? And the ones that stand out to me, I think, from Augustine are encourage curiosity, encourage broader thinking, provide safe spaces to explore other ways of doing things, because it's very easy for teachers to close down creativity and alternate ways of thinking. Encourage questioning, and also a capacity to find the answers in various ways. And so what are the sources of the answers that we encourage for our students? One is certainly other people. Who do we look to, and why do we go to other people? So we need to be able to find out about other people. We need to find out who are the reliable others and why. And certainly in academic writing, we say that if you've got a PhD, you're more qualified than a master's, you're more qualified than a bachelor, and you're more qualified. But the reality of life is that it's not always about that. And one of the things that Plato and the other ancients said was that in doing a presentation, you should be evaluated on your character as well. We should introduce that with our essays, that you've got to actually add a character paragraph statement about what is your character like, reflect on it, and how are you going with character development? And we'll give you a grade on character as well as your essay. I don't know if this is going to take off, but it's such an important aspect of what's going on. And the same with, you can be doing maths tests and you can be doing English tests, but what about the character of the students? Are they growing in character and love and caring? This comes back to the Christian emphasis on character, doesn't it? And then, of course, there are the books. Are they reliable? But at the same time, you have to honour your own voice. And so you've got some students who can read the books and we can reward them with high grades. But what about those students who express themselves and struggle? How do we work with that? Someone I was talking to the other day said that we should give highest grades to the lowest scoring students because they've got the most room for improvement. And those who are up the top, they've been given all the abilities anyway, you know, gift of God and such forth. So we should give them a few grades lower. A bit like in a horse race where they have handicap, and all the good horses, they put huge weights on them. And then the horses that are still struggling a bit don't have weights on. So should we have a handicap system in our classes whereby the bright students have to carry a minus 20% in every essay? And but anyway, I don't know that this is going to take off, so you can wipe all of that. But it does get you thinking that there are other ways of seeing things, aren't there? Instead of just rewarding the higher grades, we need to think about every student has something to offer, including some may have character and love and care and helping, but may not be the brightest IQ student in the class. But they should be rewarded. And hopefully in your reports that you write, you will be able to write about those. I think I read a report about Albert Einstein said that he was doing okay, but there were areas for improvement. And so I think, every student, there are areas for improvement, aren't there? Let me mention a very important resource, James K.A. Smith. Hands up anyone who's come across James K.A. Smith and his books and writings at all. I encourage you to think about going to some resources by James K.A. Smith. So if you Google James K.A. Smith, then you'll find some amazing books that you could use, and you could go to these resources by James K.A. Smith. And you can find here a list of books that he has written. And we're talking about Augustine today. And so he's written a book on the road with St. Augustine, which is very good. We're talking about Christian approaches, all things hold together with Christ. Then in your essay, we could talk about secularization. He's written a book on how not to be secular in a secular world, or in a relativist world where everyone just says, look, everyone's got their own view. James K.A. Smith writes about who's afraid of relativism and the importance of recognizing healthy communities that you're a part of. He also writes books on the kingdom of God and how worship is important. And so certainly when you're facing tough times and in Jesus' life, quoting the Psalms, prayer and worship and song can be very, very helpful. And then there's a book on teaching Christian practices, which you can find very helpful as well. Next week, we go on to science and mathematics, maths next week, science the week after. In Thinking in Tongues, he's got Pentecostal views. And then in Desiring the Kingdom, he writes about what you worship. And so in teaching, we're encouraging enthusiasm, value. It's about encouraging students that there are things that are worth worshipping, things that are good and whole and true. And even in Plato talks about that which is good and true being importance. James K.A. Smith writes about modernity as well. So there's some great resources there by James K.A. Smith. Encourage you that you might want to look them up. And some of them you can actually look the books up and they'll let you read on Amazon some of the first chapter. One of the important things that James K.A. Smith says, that you are what you love. So if you develop a spiritual power of habit, then that will shape what you love. Sometimes you go to a school and your favorite subject might be sports teaching, and they'll get you to teach English. And you think, I'm not interested in English. But you don't have much choice. You've got to teach it. And I think you'll find after a year or two of teaching English, you develop a love for teaching English. That's just part of the teaching journey. And so often it's what we develop habits, interest in, that we get good at, and we become better at doing those things. And James K.A. Smith says, the good things you do, the habits that you do, whether you take up sport or exercise, that will shape your world. If you take up less healthy things like eating cream pies, then that habit will shape, I don't know how cooks go. Imagine if you're a cook making meringues and vanilla slices. I mean, surely you'd become incredibly overweight because that's your love. But James K.A. Smith says you are what you love, and that your habits shape what you love. And in teaching, we're sharing our enthusiasms and our habits and things that we love with the students. We need to be careful that we share the good things with the students. You'll have to make up your mind about the cream pies and the other things there. I've said to my class one year, I'll give higher grades, this was bribery, if you attach a meringue to your assignments and some of the, or a chocolate bar. Some of the students are wondering now that we've switched to Moodle, how you attach chocolate bars and meringues to your assignments. I've got to think that through. But I'm also, that could be unethical, so we should delete that part of things as well. I don't know whether you can staple a meringue to the front of your essay, but I'll think that through. I need to move on from my poor comical ways. Actually, comedy is an important part of the class as well, isn't it? But you need to have the lighter moments and the serious moments, and you need to teach the students how to shift from one to another. Certainly, James K.A. Smith's book, Imagining the Kingdom, How Worship Works, reminds us that worship makes a difference in the classroom as a teacher. Having an attitude of worship, respecting good and valuable, is very important. And what we worship and uphold as valuable reflects our worldview and shapes worldview and shapes culture as well. And James K.A. Smith says that every culture and period of history worships something. And in Essay 2, we need to reflect on what is being worshipped at the time in history that we live. And one of the more recent books that he has written is on how to inhabit time. And James K.A. Smith says, many Christians are disconnected from the past. They believe we only live in the present. Or they imagine that we're above history. It's not important the way things were done 100 years ago. They're immune to history. Every generation has a clean start. It does not to look at history. But they suffer from a lack of awareness of time and the effects of history, both personal and collective. They are naive about current issues and fixated on end times, he says. And so in Essay 2, we ask you to reflect on your setting, your context in the flow of history. And so we are living in 2022. It's a particular period in history. And in terms of geography, we are living in certain geographic settings. Can I get everyone to write down now, what are 2 or 3 things that characterize our time in history? You could write down individualism. That is, are we living in a time in history that's individualist, whereas back in the 1400s, people lived in a collectivist, communal, family-oriented period in time? You could write down consumerism. Are we living in a period of time in which our governments encourage shopping centres, councils encourage these shopping centres, which are all focused on the latest pair of shoes, the latest shirt with a name brand on it? We don't encourage things that last. Or do we need to encourage people to buy a jacket that's going to last for 10 years rather than throw out society? Do we live in a disposable society? So these are all things that can be used to label our history. One of the reasons we have museums, and you may take your students to a museum at times, is they encourage an awareness of the flow of history. And in a museum, they may go to the Egyptian section, which would show some mummies, and there's a whole view of the Egyptian world. And then they'll go to the Greek section. They probably don't do enough on Plato. Did you know, I visited Greece once and I went with my wife to find Plato's, where he used to have his academy, and I was horrified. They walked their dogs where Plato once taught, and I thought, this is the end of the world, but that's another story. There should be great plaques and statues of Plato and places to gather and to talk and to internet connections where you could download his material. I was horrified. And so it's a period of time, Greek history, which was different to our time in history. And then came the Romans, and they taught us how to build roads and how to have laws. So, and even today, we still use Roman laws in Latin. So they gave us the Latin language. And then came the Middle Ages and the whole medieval time. And then in the Middle Ages, there came that time of chivalry where men lay down their coats for women to walk on. And so there was a whole time. And then we come to the 1800s when they developed industrialization and steam trains. And then in the 1900s, we came to cars. So maybe that's one way of describing the world we live in today. It's the motor car oriented world. We all oriented around that. And this is called modernity. And modernity is all about material things and the ways we do things. And then some people said we've moved on from modernity and we've moved on to post-modernity. And then there is a quote from one of our readings where Einstein said, you've given the students the same class question as last year, and Einstein said, that's okay, because the answers have changed. And so we live in a most postmodern world where all the answers have changed. So all the answers are different in the postmodern world. And there can be a healthy postmodernism which says that we're finding out more, and there can be an unhealthy postmodernism which says that everything is relative and no one knows what's going on anymore. So relativism. Just going through some of these thoughts. Tiffany, what would your thoughts be?
So I've written down that I think that our world today is very socially orientated. Your social status has a lot to do with how you're viewed in our world today. I think that our world has changed to a very I'm not really sure how to explain it, but like an opinionated world. Everyone has an opinion on something, and we're all told to listen to everyone's opinions. Like it's very valued. Your opinion's valued in some settings. And then on the other side of that, I think that our world has become quite rude in a way. I feel like the way we interact with each other has changed because of social media and our social status and things. People can become quite rude and like obnoxious in a way.
That's very well said. I think that we've seen the rights of everyone. So they're human rights. And so women have equal rights to men, young have equal rights to older people, etc. But in order to give everyone rights and everyone entitled to their own opinion, as you said, there's an arrogance. And so I think that's very, very well said. Ethan, what are your thoughts on these matters where we are in history? And this applies to assignment 2, where you are encouraged to reflect on time in history, and it also applies with the week 4 discussion on the nature of history. Ethan. And while we're waiting for Ethan, Leonie, what are your thoughts there? Leonie.
I completely agree with Tiffany. The school where I'm at the moment, I stay in the school's hostel, so I'm constantly watching what the kids are doing as well. And you can clearly see like the change in behavior and the whole social status orientation. One is better than the other, and that influences a lot of things in the classroom. And behavior, they're also rude, disrespectful, and I really think with the students being on social media so much, they're not exposed to people that that teach them how to act. So I think that's a big issue that we're dealing with.
Yeah, so good. Excellent points there. Marisia, your thoughts on where we're at in the flow of history?
The only one that I've got down that no one has sort of said is like mass media and like idolization of fame and famous people, almost in that like false idol sense. You know, we make these famous people who have very questionable morals by the looks of it, most of them, but people sort of transform them into gods. I remember when Shane Warne passed away, it was actually my auntie was like carrying on as though you know, the world had lost this great man, but if actually you kind of look at the context of his life and his behavior, I'm not sure I would kind of use the word great. But anyway, yeah, so it's sort of just
Shane Warne.
Yeah.
Yeah, so good. And Rachel, your thoughts on where we are in the flow of time?
Yeah, kind of to go with what everyone was saying, I think we're a very materialistic world as well. Like money's always been important to, like, you know, where your social status is, but I think there's in a way more of an emphasis on like the money you make and how well you can get on in life. And then in the sense of like, we have such fast fashion now, that it's like, it's so easy for us to go to Kmart and get a $10-15 top that's in season, you know, in the next, you know, 6 months, but then next year we've got to throw it away because either it's torn to shreds because it's not great quality, or it's, you know, out of fashion. We go, oh, well, we can't be seen wearing the last season's fashion. So, and just like this constant flow of things, is like Karen said in the chat, things are so disposable, not only clothes and materialistic things, but sometimes people treat you like you're disposable, or you can treat others like you're disposable.
I really like that point about people being treated as disposable and students being treated as disposable and as admin being treated as disposable. So I think that's really well said. Amy, your thoughts on where we are in the flow of time? And
Yeah, I agree with pretty much what everyone said so far. I would just add, yeah, I really like the point that we said, the idolization of people on social media. I definitely think like technology has even boosted that so much more, even in consumerism. But there's this whole idea that even though everyone has a voice, there's also cancel culture that takes away that. It's almost given us like a right to completely silence people as well. But it's not really in this, there's not really an open dialogue, I'd say. It's just very quick to kind of jump on and kind of cancel that out.
Yeah, so good. Now, all of these things can be covered in assignment 2, but you have to be careful, of course. You don't want to make it too big, but it's worth thinking about, is there 1 or 2 words that describe your personal view of the world, worldview, what shaped your view of the world? And in particular today, we're focusing on your Christian view of the world, or your spiritual view of the world, or your worldview. So we're looking at that, but we're also wanting to briefly mention history. And James K.A. Smith, in his book on time, says that we need to give people an awareness of the flow of time in which we are at. So it's worth being aware of these perspectives that are there. So this Friday class today has provided an opportunity to discuss questions, application, and ideas, particularly Christian understandings on thinking and truth in terms of Jesus and what he said. More broadly, we could talk about the Old Testament and the Psalms. We could talk about Paul, but through history, we could look at great writers, and we've had opportunity in our readings to touch on Augustine. We could go further and we could look at Thomas Aquinas. And so that would be interesting. And we could look at great figures in history as well. Just this last few days, I had a chance to go to Rouen and see the place where Joan of Arc was. And then Joan of Arc was a young lady who at age 13 felt she heard God speaking to her. And then she went to the king and said, you need to stand up for France against her enemies. The king did so. Great battles were won. And then people stood back from her. And anyone know what happened to Joan of Arc? Rachel, do you remember the story? What happens to Joan of Arc, who after age 19 led the French to some great victories? And then what does the king and others do? What happens, Rachel?
From memory, they thought she was a witch because she predicted what was going to happen, and they burnt her alive at the stake.
Exactly. So if that happens to us as teachers, then don't be surprised. So they put her on trial, but there were political things going on at the time. And if they let her go, then the French army might go marching across everywhere. So the English who had captured her said, we've got to prove that she's a heretic. So for some reason, they stole her clothes, and the only clothes that she had to wear were men's clothes. Because she put the men's clothes back on, they said she must be a relapsed person. And then they called theologians in from the University of Paris, which is the theological college, and they said, test her and find out, but we want you to find her guilty as being a heretic. And so they found her guilty. And then they quickly rushed her in the morning before the trial could go any further, burnt her at the stake, and then they said, don't ask any more questions, just do it. And so when she was 19 years of age, they did that. Now, they then wrote to the Pope, because she had appealed to the Pope, that if they were really going to find out whether she was a heretic, they should really go through things. So it took about 10 years or more to finally persuade the Pope that there should be a retrial. Finally, they did hold a retrial. Rachel, do you remember the outcome of the retrial?
Not off the top of my head.
So she was found not guilty in all areas. Certainly it was questionable whether she could claim to hear voices from God, but she'd never actually said anything wrong, never done anything wrong. She was found not guilty. And then, interestingly, the church said, well, can we make up for it in some way? Let's make her a saint. So they then went back, and in 1920, the church made her a saint. Ironical in some ways, because the church was relied upon by the British to find her guilty of being a heretic in order that the English could have power over the French at the time, which they politically saw as correct. But it reminded me of being so very similar to the Jesus story as well, is that they put someone on trial, but when they think about it, he was put on trial for saying that people should love one another, care for one another, have faith in God, etc. And most people would say, as Pilate did, that how can that really be the case? And so this reminds us of the words of Jesus, and he was taken to the high priest, and if I've said something wrong, testify what I have said as wrong. It was then taken to Pilate. What charges are you bringing against this man? He's not a criminal. But they said, we've handed him over. He must be guilty. And so Pilate said, well, you've got laws. And they didn't find that worked. So they said, we just want you to execute him. And Pilate went back inside and said, are you a king of all the Jewish people? And Jesus said, who's saying this? Now, interestingly here, it goes back to our reading on, do you just follow the group, or do you follow your conscience or stand up for what is true? do you join the 3%? And Jesus said, is this your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me? And that's one of the challenges of today's lesson, I think, is that do we just follow the way things are done, or do we just stand up for what is true? And when accusations are brought about another student, another teacher, another admin, do we just go along with things, or do we stand up with what is truth? And even more challenging, when accusations are brought against you and I by students, parents, admin, do we stand for truth or not? And then, like Joan of Arc, Jesus, others, what happens when we go through the tough times? So Jesus raises an important point about truth, and that's what this subject is about. And we can use descriptions of truth which say legally this must happen and miss out on the core of truth. We can use descriptions about students or other teachers or ourselves. What's really important is authenticity, integrity. We can be aware of politics and being puppets of others. And Pilate said, "Am I a Jew?" This recognizes that there are cultures that shape us. Jesus was a Jew, and Pilate said, "You've got to be accountable to your own people, to your own culture." And he said, Pilate handed him back to the Jews. So really, you've got to understand your culture, your people as well. Again, there's a political approach to truth here. Truth is determined often by power games, by power decisions, by human interest. And we've got to ask, when we're making decisions in our teaching, are we just following practical interests, human interests, or are we pursuing truth? And that's one of the big questions raised in assignment 2. What is truth in the classroom? And you might have one student says they're bullied, but in actual, that student might be causing troubles. You might say, what's the truth that's going on? People might be wrestling over the question of evolution and creation, but really the issues might be something bigger and deeper. What are the values there? What's going on? And this is similar to Plato. Character and truth are very important. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were so, my servants would use swords and things of this world to fight and prevent my arrest. My kingdom comes from another place." This reminds us as Christians, where do your values come from? Where does your kingdom come from? And for Jesus, it was a heavenly, hope-filled kingdom. For the Apostle Paul, a heavenly, hope-filled kingdom. For Martin Luther, when he stood up to the church, and then for the Counter-Reformation, when it stood up to Martin Luther, both are looking towards a better kingdom. So is that helpful, this discussion of what Jesus said? And Pilate used the phrase, quid est veritas, in Latin, what is truth, the Roman legal language. And so Pilate challenges the claim to be a witness to truth, and we could think more deeply about this question of Jesus claiming to be truth. So what's meant by truth from a Christian perspective? Next week, we'll go on and look at mathematical insights into truth, and then science insights into truth, and then literature, which can describe human failings, then poetry and music. All of these things can give insights into truth. But the Apostle Paul gives us an insight into a higher way. And he said, you can speak with eloquence and tongues of men and angels, but if you don't have love, you're like a rusty, creaking gate or teacher, clanging cymbal. Love is patient and kind, not focused on oneself, not envious, doesn't strut or boast or proud, sits down with the students, doesn't have a swelled head, it's not self-seeking, doesn't force itself on others, isn't easily angered, doesn't fly off the handle, doesn't keep score of sins or record of wrongs, doesn't delight in evil, but rejoices in truth. And so part of the process of going on year after year in teaching is maturing, leaving behind childish ways, and becoming more complete and whole. So part of the teaching journey is understanding self and the ways in which we change and mature. And so I encourage you to keep a journal. I encourage you to reflect on what you're learning in your 4 subjects or so, to reflect on the challenges. And most of all, I encourage you to journal about the tough times. So journal about the good times and the tough times, and then think about what are the strategies for facing the tough times. In the army, when they train people, they don't just sit back and eat cream cakes. They actually go out and they practice facing the tough times. So I encourage you as teachers, be aware that there can come tough times, and think about what will you do when the parents raise the tough questions, admin raise the tough questions, students raise the tough questions. And remember 1 Corinthians chapter 13, show love and kindness and share those good things that God has shared with us. Can I get everyone to write down now, what are 2 or 3 things that stood out today, or 1, 2 or 3 things in our tutorial today? So we're reflecting on these points that we've raised. And as Rachel said, just had a What's the Truth chat with some of the boys I teach. And so it reminds us that the questions of truth is an important question in the classroom. Amy, what are your thoughts from today? What are some of the things that have stood out? And if you have questions that are practical for the assignment, raise them as well. But what stood out today, Amy?
Sorry, I was just writing. I'm still processing all of it. I think from today, it's still honestly the importance of questioning. How we were talking about, we need to really encourage curiosity and provide those safe spaces to explore, and just about how pretty much how culture has changed over time as we were reflecting on the context of history. But those are the main areas that stood out to me today. I am still currently reflecting. I need a bit more time.
Yeah, that sounds good. And there are some Moodle resources that we've put up on methods in history. Some people have seen history as telling a story. And so you can tell a story about Jesus that's all wonderful and positive and skip over the cross. You could over-focus on the cross and forget the resurrection. And so you've got to balance all aspects of history. When it comes to the story of Joan of Arc, you could also tell one story or another story. So there are perspectives, but history is also about what is truth and what is taking place. And so when it comes to telling the story of Jesus, I think it's important to keep character and love and God as central. Bridget, what stood out today?
For me would be a couple of things when we were talking about the safe place, giving the kids a safe place and environment, and a chance to explore, always questioning. I think when we talk about questioning and how important that is in a classroom is always great, and what that may look like. And when we were talking about truth and like understanding someone's culture and background, and in figuring out what is actually true and the truth.
Yeah, and that's so important to understand the cultural background. If you've got 25 or 30 students, if you've got 100 teachers, if you've got 30 or 40 admin, they're going to have all these different cultural backgrounds and perspectives, and we've got to be aware of those and take time. And we see that in Pilate talking to Jesus, what is truth? And there are different cultural perspectives, but behind it all, there is God who is good And that's where truth is found, is in the goodness of God. And even Plato talks about the gods of God, that there is that which is good. And it's important that we understand our values and that we state these values in the classroom. What are the values that we are committed to? Rachel, what stood out today?
I think two big things are like what everyone said is finding a safe place for kids, but also like being that safe place. Because like I was saying before, that what's the truth conversation I had with those two young boys, especially with one of them, because I know him personally. He's actually my senior's pastor's kid, so I see him quite a lot, and I know he's very defensive about a lot of things, that if I didn't tell him and if he didn't trust me and feel like I was a safe space, that conversation would have not happened, or not happened the same way it did. But then also like talking about Joan of Arc and how just like my perspective and my takeaway of like sometimes we are too harsh, too quick to judge, and that we need to take that time to find that truth, and not just be so jumpy about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's very good. And then, as you say, the Joan of Arc example is an important one. Karen, what stood out to you today?
I think the discussion that we all had with dealing with conflict was very interesting for me. How we can gain support, or where we can gain support from, finding our inner strength through scripture. And I also like the quote, "You are what you love." I highlighted that because I thought that was really good.
Yeah, so good. So there's lots of great things that we're picking up on. Now, don't forget, we've got assessment 2 coming up. Is someone able to give me the how many weeks until assessment 2 is due? Someone got it there in front of me. Libby, when's assessment 2 due?
I think it's,
sorry. Is it the 18th?
Yep.
September?
So, yep, Rachel, is that right? The 18th?
Yeah, it's right next to me. It's 18th of September, so about 3 weeks.
So you've got about 3 weeks till the 18th of September. So I encourage you to read the question, reflect on it. I also encourage you to reflect on the 4 weeks of notes and Moodle, and you can go beyond that. You can start to look at what we've got unfolding there. I encourage you to do, if you've not done so already, but a lot of people have done some great posts on post 4, which is there as well. And then next week, you'll be looking at mathematics. And one of the really interesting things about looking at mathematics is that it's not just about numbers, but there's something wonderful about how they're reliable, they're set in place. It tells us something about the reliability of God, the architect of all things. And so it's interesting to think about God, the creator, and mathematics. We'll cover that next week. I'll remind you that we have, firstly, I think the most important thing is the forum post. So make sure you keep up with the forum post. Before that, even more important than the forum post that's worth 10% or so, there is the assignments. So assignment 2 and 3 is where you're going to get your grades. So make sure you put your time into that. And in terms of academic writing, make sure that you've got good resources. So you really want 8, 10, 12 or more scholarly resources. So we want good scholarly, reliable resources, which means that it's by a recognised, well-known scholar who use references, and it's in a scholarly journal or book. So we want scholarly resources, and generally a good number of those, 10, 12 or more scholarly references and resources. We then want well-developed paragraphs, and we also want the whole thing developed in a well-developed construction where you've got an introduction, arguments and conclusion that pull it all together. Generally, it's best to focus on a smaller group of ideas. So you want one major argument that you're presenting, and then within that some sub-arguments. And we said last week that you need to focus on one or two or three academic areas, whether it be students in the classroom, behaviour, or whether it be subject areas. You want to focus on that a bit as well. And we don't want too much in the first person, where and you will want it objective and scholarly voice. But you could have a little paragraph in the first person as well. Then we've got Moodle resources that you can read each week. And then we've got videos of past classes, and we encourage you to watch those. Now, with the videos, you can, in fact, click on show transcript, and you could even cut and paste if you wanted the whole transcript of the video from past classes. You could make a copy of that and read through that. And so I encourage you to have a look at the Moodle resources there. So hands up those who have questions about the assignment or about the subject. I think we're making good progress. Certainly a very interesting topic that you're showing a lot of interest in, that really applies in the classroom. Great thoughts being raised every week. Next week, when we look at mathematics, one of the things that could be discussed is maths phobia, where there's a fear of maths. If you don't have maths phobia, you probably have a phobia for some other subject. Hands up anyone who might have a maths fear or phobia. So there's a couple of tentative hands going up, and then others are asking, is this a safe space? And so I think we all have subjects that we struggle with, and there are times when maths, which could be a celebration of the creation of God as an ordered world, becomes a struggle to do algebra and calculus and really complex things. And so again, this, as teachers, reminds us that there will be students in our class that are struggling with reading, writing, and particular with maths. And we could reflect on that, how we cope. Hannah, any thoughts on how do we help students who've got maths phobia?
I kind of think that the best way is to kind of get alongside them and do it with them. Like, we can teach it from the front as much as possible and explain it in multiple different ways.
Yeah, that's so good. So
let's break it down, do this, you've succeeded, good job, let's go on to the next one.
Yeah.
Because, I was homeschooled and so self-taught a lot of the way, and the best way for me to understand something was actually just to go up to my mum and go, can you work through this with me? And even if she was learning it alongside me, even just hearing it said from a different way helped to understand and me get over the scariness of it. Or someone also going, yeah, it can be a bit scary, it can be a bit big.
Yeah. And make it fun and relevant too. I'm sure you'd recognise as so when you're doing fractions, cut up a cake and share a cake and talk about it that way, and then make it relevant. We're going to the shop. Can I give you some monies to buy something? And then how would you spend it? So there's lots of ways, and certainly one of the most important ways is to show the different ways of viewing maths. Maths is not meant to be a painful adherence to law, but it's meant to be a celebration of different ways of knowing and understanding. And then the following week, we move on to science. And again, there can be a problem with some students seeing science as you've got to put on a white lab coat, you've got to do things in a certain way, but science can be way more interesting. There's so many different ways of looking at things. And today we've just touched on history briefly, as that there are different views on history, and then there is what occurred. And then we have to choose out of all the things that occurred, what do we focus on? And depending on the different focus interests, then we may have different areas that we can look at as well. So thank you each one. If you have any questions, certainly send me emails. If you see things that don't work, send me emails. I very much look at catching up there. So enjoying all your responses, they're terrific, and enjoying the way we're able to talk about real life situations in the classroom and your openness to talking about them one with another. It's really encouraging to see you thinking about the bigger tasks and the humanity and the God-given life and vitality and hope and love and joy that we can have in our classrooms and our teaching. So thank you each one. Let me just briefly pray as we conclude. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today's class, the opportunities to meet and to share, for all that we're learning. And we pray that your presence would be with us as we grow and change, as we learn and as we share your truths rather than our opinions with others. Amen. So thank you each one. See you next time.
Thank you, Dr.
Dr. Can I grab you back for like 2 minutes? Just sorry if I came late to class. I got my times confused. Also sorry for leaving